Hi, everybody. I'm Giulio. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm going to describe this model tool very quickly. There are many pieces. I'm not going to show any equation. I'm just going to give you 30,000 feet description of it. So the purpose of this model is to make prediction of marsh landscape, mostly marsh elevation as spatially distributed. So not just one point, but the 2D marsh as a function of parameters like sea level rise, sediment supply, and tidal range. And importantly, as a function of maintenance. And what I focus here is the extent of ditch that are maintained. So we're not gonna dig new ditches. Apparently, you cannot really do that, but you can maintain the existing one. And you can choose which one to maintain and how deep to maintain them. And the idea is to make it easy to access the results. And for that, we preloaded simulations. So we have a lot of different cases, but still not all the possible cases. So we had a trade-off of making it very easy to access, but including all the possible geometry and parameters. So this is kind of the synopsis of the processes. And really, I boiled down to three components. One is kind of the elevation dynamics without ponds and ditches. Then is the pond dynamic, and then is the ditch dynamic. So the baseline model, maybe you have heard about the marsh evolution model from Gene Morris. So the idea is that you simulate the organic accretion by plants, like the root and rhizomes that decompose and accumulate with time. So this is a very simple model. The idea is that you simulate a cohort vegetation, and that vegetation is a function of the elevation and the tidal range. So indirectly on the hydro period, you have a maximum optimum elevation. And if you are too high, you would grow less. If you are too low to submergence, no plants. So there is no alternative flora patents, but you can imagine if it's very, very high, it's less productive, so kind of simulating maybe a patents vegetation. So then there is inorganic accretion. So the sediment, mostly mud, is the function of hydro period elevation. So the lower, the more you can accumulate. And that depends on the sediment concentration. And here is the sediment concentration is spatially variable. Mostly it's higher, closer to the channel, where we impose kind of a reference sediment concentration. And farther from the channel, you go in the interior marsh, you have less sediment. And then there is also bank slamping. So the bank material kind of slowly diffuse downstream and cause a lowering of the elevation just very close to the channels. So this is the baseline model, and it's already 2D. Now include the dynamics of the ponds. And there are two ingredients for that. So first, ponds form. It can be anything. It can be a dock, it can be a storm, it can be some rock material, maybe a slow depression. You randomly can form a tiny perturbation. So a pond is maybe a small area that has standing water, so the vegetation doesn't grow. You can be at an absolute high elevation, but if you have a local depression, the water doesn't drain and the vegetation dies. So if you're a pond, you slowly tend to deepen and expand, mostly by biochemical process. You might have sulfate reduction, so you slowly chew up the organic matter, so you slowly deepen and you slowly widen, and you can even merge with other ponds. And then if you get large enough, eventually you might encounter a channel, and then you are drained, and you're not more a pond, you're just kind of an area that can be filled in if there is enough sediment supply, enough tidal range to bring the sediment in, and also this that accretion is higher than the relative sea level rise. Sharon nicely showed that you can have accretion rate of 10 millimeters per year. So at least in New England, we are pretty good for some times in the future, hopefully. So these three processes. Just an example, this is it was not from 38, but 1973 to 2018, just to show that ponds are slowly expanding. It's kind of slow. It's only like 5 centimeters per year, but ponds tend to slowly expand and possibly even merge. This is an example of pond drainage in Barnstable Marsh. So 2007, the pond was isolated, standing water, and then there was a channel that naturally formed. And then here you can see a low tide that the pond becomes exposed, and this is slowly filling in. You can see that there is patches of vegetation enlarging. So the idea is that these in a couple of decades is increasing a lot, and pretty much the prediction is that in a few decades it's just going to become flush or almost flush with the marsh. So the ponds, and now we have the ditches. So we already mentioned that there is a lot of ditches in New England, here in Barnstable. Likely this was, for science, it was only done in certain areas. So you can see very well the comparison between unditched and ditch marshes. So these did two things. First, it drained ponds. That's why ditch were dug, to drain the ponds. So the ponds are kind of disappearing because all of a sudden they become connected to the channel network. But then there is this other effect of the lowering. Well, what happened? So if you have, without ditches, the water table in the marsh interior is pretty high. You only have maybe some evapotranspiration, but the channels are too far to drain effectively the water table. But if you put ditches every 10 meters, you locally lower the water table, and that's enough for the surrounding area to have a lowering of the water table. Now, if you lower the water table, there are two consequences. You have more consolidation just because you don't have the water effect that holds the soil. This is a standard geotechnical consequence of lowering the water table in a compressible soil. And also you have more carbon oxidation, more oxygen, the organic matter decompose. So we just simulate the resulting effect of creating the ditches, of adding an extra lowering, which we estimated on the order of 2-3 millimeters per year, and it's larger closer to the ditch and decreases away from the ditches. And by the way, we know that draining wetlands or bogs or fens lower the elevation. This is a famous example from the UK, where draining a wetland, more like a terrestrial wetland, lowered the ground by 4 meters in 150 years. So we know this is an effect that exists. We just need to quantify it. So the model, all this process is put together. We use this domain for the Barnstable Marsh. So this is the elevation right now, and this is the best representation from the model. So we run this model we run the whole marsh for maybe 1,000 years with a slow sea level rise, so simulating the marsh formation with all the pond dynamics. Then we start adding the increase in sea level rise at the beginning of the 21st century. Then in the 30s, we add the ditches, we tune all the parameters, and this is our best representation or modeling of the present day marsh. You can see that matches well enough the measure value, the measure elevation. Now, clearly we cannot predict exactly where the ponds are going to form. It's kind of a stochastic process, but statistically they are very similar. Also, here I emphasize that in this model, we fix the channel geometry. So given a domain, we copy what is the channels right now, and they become frozen with time. It's a simplification that we need to use to make the model run very fast and also reduce the number of possible parameters. And also the ditches, clearly we dug the ditches in the model exactly where they are in present in the current situation. So we did this, and throughout this project, we included some of the end user feedbacks. So the end user told us what we can control. Well, we cannot control sea level rise but as a society maybe, but we can control locally the amount of ditch that we maintain. So do we maintain all the ditches, meaning everywhere there is a ditch, if the ditch is filling in, we're going to maintain at that depth. So we go there every year, and 100% of those ditches, we maintain them. Or maybe we'd only maintain 50%, meaning that one ditch we maintain, the other ditch, we just let it evolve naturally, which is mostly filling in with sediment and slumping in. The other thing we can control is the depth of the ditch maintained. Do we maintain at 50 centimeters depth, or we maybe only dig it to 20 centimeters, which is what is called a runnel. So those are the two maintenance options. And before going in the results, just a caveat, in this model, we don't include channel dynamics, meaning that the channel are frozen, they don't widen, and don't migrate, even in 1,000 years. There is no wave edge erosion, so this doesn't really apply to places facing open water. There is no upland migration, so the marshland cannot expand, and there is no salinity effects. So I'll show you some of the model results directly from this website. Do you see the website, Jean-Marie? Yes, perfect. So there is all the description of the model and some validation, but let's jump to the some of the results. So the first here is the results from the Great Barnstable Marsh. So this is the model present day. I showed that already in my slide. So this is our best guess of what should be the present day configuration of Barnstable Marsh. This is elevation, and it's not starting from mean sea level rise. It starts from 1 meter to 1.8 meter above mean sea level. So the tidal range is fixed here in Barnstable, but we assume it doesn't change, and there is a quite large sediment concentration. So this is present day, and then we can do predictions about the future. Well, we can see what is going to be in the future with if the sea level rise will remain 3 millimeters per year, and we keep maintaining all the ditches, 100% of the ditches at the ditch depth, which is about 50 centimeters. So predictions, well, is not going to change a lot. Well, the ponds are going to do their dynamics, but generally the system is going to remain similar to that. Now, clearly, if sea level rise increases by 2100, the marsh is going to be lower. We can also show maybe not so far in the future, but quite still far in the future. So year 2050. So the marsh has not lower as much. And again, we can do this for 3 different rate of sea level rise. So let's say we pick 2100, that is quite far in the future. And let's say the sea level rise was only 3 millimeters per year, so very optimistic. Well, what we can say is, what if we only maintain 50% of the ditches? So you can see that every other ditch was not maintained, and in about 90, 80 years, this area got filled in, and actually even new ponds starts to form. Maybe you can see better if maybe we start with present day, there is the ditches, and then 2050, we only maintain every other, and these ditches you can see start filling in, and by 2100, they're kind of get much higher elevation because there is enough sediment and sea level rise is not very fast. What if we maintain 50% but at a lower elevation? So maybe we do it as a runoff, and you can see that now they are maintained and not so much elevation. So they are shallower, and also the surrounding area that gets less subsidence because of the runoffs cause less subsidence. So all of these is a map. We have also the accretion rate for all these possibilities. And going back here, we also have summary of this elevation. So we can imagine this one is the altered area on the left. This is the natural one. And then you have the area close to the channel and the interior marsh. So there is these 4 possible section of the marsh, and then we do just the histogram of the elevation. So for example, the near channel has a higher elevation than the interior channels. And they just report mean, median, and other statistics. We also put the marsh in 4 possible categories. So it's a marsh, which is either low marsh or high marsh, depending on whether it's higher and lower than mean high water. You have ponds, which would be a place that is isolated. It might have a high absolute elevation, but if it's not connected to a channel, it's considered a pond. And then you have unvegetated marsh. So if you are below mean sea level, you're mostly, well, you're kind of a mud flat. You can call it an unvegetated marsh or a mud flat. So again, for these, the 4 possible sections, we just do the percentage of how much of the marsh falls in each category. And so this is for, we also have a summary, which show how the percentage of the 4 category change through time according to whatever sea level rise and maintenance scenarios. So this is kind of only really apply for barnstable marsh. To make it a little more general, we tweak this model, and so this looks very similar, but conceptually should be seen in a different way. So here we use the geometry of barnstable just to have that channel network, channel geometry, and then we allow this to be a different system. So maybe this is no more barnstable, it's a marsh with this geometry, but with this microtidal range and maybe a sediment concentration in the channel of 50 milligrams per liter. So this is how this hypothetical marsh should look like at present day. Notice that the scale bar now is different. And then we can do predictions about the future. What if we do it, how it's gonna look in 2100 if we don't maintain 0% of the ditch while the ditches are filling in and new ponds are gonna form? What if we maintain 100% of the ditches? Well, we maintain the ditches. What if the sea level rise is very high? It's 9 millimeters per year. It's not gonna look good while the marshes start to erode away. Well, it is mostly drowning, and it doesn't really matter what you do here. So maybe let's consider a little more optimistic situation with a smaller rate of sea level rise. So for example, here you can see that the ditching is actually enhancing the lowering of the marsh, just because there is not enough sediment and sea level rise is very high. So maybe if we consider less ditching or no ditching at all, you don't have the additional subsidence effect. You still get some ponds forming in the interior. So in general, smaller tidal range and low sediment supply and high sea level rise will predict that marshes are losing, especially in the interior. And again, for this one, you can do, you can get the summary of the marsh type extent as a function of time. And you can even download it. If I do these, I think it's gonna get an Excel file and it's gonna give these values as actual numbers. So it might be used to evaluate. So for example, if we have, in this scenario, this is what is gonna look if we have no ditch maintenance, or instead if we do 50% of the maintenance at runnel depth, it's only going to change in the interior, in the ditch area, clearly not in the natural area, and is only really going to change in the interior of the ditch area. So the model does spatial predictions, really, or it's either for the barnstable marsh, but maybe you're not just interested in the barnstable marsh. So it does prediction for an idealized marsh. Right now, we only have preloaded simulations, but maybe those can inform qualitatively other type of marshes. The model source code is available, but we couldn't run all the possible geometry and configuration. So to run it, to get results from a specific marsh, you will need to use the actual source code, which is written in MATLAB and requires a little knowledge of programming. Right now, the management options that we consider is the amount of ditch that are maintained. You can either maintain all of them, 50% of them, or only 25% of them, and the depth at which you maintain them. You can even have a ditch depth or a much shallower ditch, which is called a runnel. So we can predict the elevation in space, the accretion rates and the amount of pond area. Again, pond is, it's potentially high elevation, absolutely, but it's not connected to a channel, so the water is impounded and the vegetation, marsh vegetation, doesn't grow. And this could be useful for many things. One is to interpret field measurements, and now we have, the last decades, a lot of measurements, including from surface elevation tables, and even responding to one of the comments in the chat. So the model, for example, predicts that in the marsh interior, because of the pond recovery, you can get accretion rates higher than the rate of sea level rise, which normally it would be hard to explain. Why would the marsh interior accrete faster than sea level rise? The marsh should kind of go higher than the mean high water. Well, that is possible because that place temporarily, when that area was a pond, was losing elevation or was not accreting fast enough. So the same spot throughout a long time might either lose elevation compared to sea level rise when it's a pond, and then when it recover, is going to get a very high accretion rate. So if you only measure accretion rates in the last 50 years, you might get something higher than the rate of sea level rise rate.